Hi folks, and welcome to our course, Native American Genocides. In this video lecture, I'm going to introduce the course before reviewing this week's learning objectives and readings. Our course focuses on the so-called Indian problem, the phraseology of which predates that of its more notorious semantic cousin, the so-called Jewish problem. As we'll see this week, the fundamental issue behind the Indian problem is land. Quite simply, indigenous peoples have it, and settlers want it. To the extent that indigenous peoples have gotten in the way of this process, they have become quote-unquote problems. That, in a nutshell, is the summary of this course, the goal of which is to examine the manifold ways in which this so-called problem has attempted to be solved. This broad range of genocide is reflected in our course structure. Later, I'll explain how this outline corresponds with the three strategic phases of settler colonialism, as well as with Raphael Lemkin's three categories of genocidal techniques, both of which provide a neat, tripartite, overarching conceptual framework that structures our course outline. For weeks 2 and 3, we'll look at the intersecting factors that have caused the mass death of Native Americans. Weeks 4 and 5 look at how multiple forms of dispossession have restricted indigenous peoples' abilities to reproduce, thereby jeopardizing their survival. Weeks 6 and 7 examine the enduring harms of Indian boarding schools in North America, as well as the politically compromised structures that reproduce colonial injustices today. Finally, Week 8 uses Holocaust memory as a lens through which to examine the memories and silences produced by sites of memory in the US and Canada. Alright, quick note about the course readings. These are our required textbooks, but I don't assign every page from each book. And moreover, each week, these books are going to be joined by several other articles or book selections. There'll be about 7 to 8 readings per week, of which you're expected to read about 3 to 4. So out of the different reading options each week, you get to pick and choose. Those of you who've taken me before are familiar with this image and quote, which I use to illustrate the digestion metaphor to reading. The idea being that some works can just be skimmed, like sampling an appetizer tray, whereas other works have to be closely read, like devouring an entree. Remember, you don't have to approach all readings the same way. I trust your discretion in determining your own reading load. Besides, my idea is to give you the resources and framework for continuing these studies on your own. Each week, I provide a list of learning objectives that can be used as prompts for the discussion forum. I also use these objectives to organize my video lecture. So with that said, let's get into the content this week. Our story begins with reading 1. The 1977 International NGO Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations was a formative moment in the contemporary history of the Indigenous rights movement, attended by over 400 people representing NGOs, international organizations, member states of the UN, as well as over 100 Indigenous representatives from some 60 different Indigenous groups across the Americas. This movement marked the coalescence of a transnational advocacy network that managed to leverage new forms of social activism to essentially get on the agenda of global governance at the UN, kicking off a chain of events that would culminate 30 years later with the passage of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is beyond our scope here. I want us to instead focus on the tone of the document, which is emblematic of what one of our readings from week 7 will call the politics of indignation, which is a close emotional correlate of injustice. You should pick up on a sense of urgency in the conference notes, with delegates appealing to the international community to stop what they saw as ongoing genocides against their peoples back home. The fundamental reason why they were there organizing in Geneva was to help secure their basic right to existence. So what we're doing in this class, it isn't merely an academic debate for some people. It's a privilege for many of us to study these issues from relatively safe confines. But for many indigenous peoples in the Americas, even today, this is a matter of collective life and social death. Indeed, going back to the historical context of the 1977 NGO conference, some of these folks were risking quite a lot, especially at a time when the Cold War in Latin America posed renewed risk to indigenous people's survival. This post-1970s context is also important for understanding the background behind Reading 2, whose author, the Shoshone historian Ned Blackhawk, was trained as a grad student in the 1990s, when the so-called New Indian History and New Western History replaced older, antiquated nationalist myths about vast empty wildlands that were inhabited by quote-unquote savages who conveniently disappeared ahead of time in order to make way for our modern society. Such false narratives have been replaced with newer, revisionist histories that stress indigenous agency and what the Ojibwe author and literary scholar Gerald Weisenor calls survivance a concept referring to the continued presence of Native peoples and their stories in spite of powerful historical and ongoing pressures for their elimination. Yet despite such promises from scholars, writers, and activists, much of our settler society remains in denial about the basic facts of Indigenous dispossession. We'll talk about that in Week 8, but for now, our goal is to chart the recent convergence between three mutually reinforcing historiographical developments. First was the revival of Raphael Lemkin and his originally broad and capacious conception of genocide, which came with the development of the colonial genocide studies literature, which we'll read about this week in the article co-authored by Dirk Moses. The second development was the rapid popularization of settler colonial studies in the wake of an influential 2006 article in the Journal of Genocide Research by Australian historian Patrick Wolfe. Now, we're not going to read that particular 2006 article, but instead an earlier essay from 2001 that laid the foundation for Wolfe's seminal idea, the logic of elimination. More on that in a moment. Finally, around the same time, in the early 2000s, scholars in Native American studies came together and organized their own scholarly community, complete with annual conferences, a journal, and so on, in order to promote Indigenous scholars and scholarship on Indigenous peoples. The author of Reading 3, Native Hawaiian scholar Ke'ulani Ka'anui, has been a prominent member of this latter intellectual community. This reading is from a book about who/what counts as Indigenous. I know that's a weird way of phrasing it. Who designates a person or people, whereas what refers to a thing. Yet it's not so much a question of who is an Indian, but rather what is used to qualify such status, and who gets to determine. Now, this reading is specifically about Native Hawaiians, but her analysis of the so-called blood quantum rule generally applies to the rest of the U.S. as well. This rule continues to be used to measure the degree of Indigenous ancestry in order to determine tribal enrollment status, i.e. membership or citizenship as part of a federally recognized tribe. Now, this rule, or technology of governance, dates back to the allotment policy of the late 19th century, which involved breaking up Indian reservations into small, individual tracts of lands called allotments that were then distributed to individual Indians. We'll talk more about this in Week 5, and how this policy was used to further dispossess millions upon millions of acres of Indigenous territories. This week, we're interested in how this rule operates as a fractionalizing measurement based on ancestry. Okay, so let's say one of your parents is Indian and the other isn't. Then your blood quantum would be 1/2. If you just had one grandparent Indian, then you'd be 1/4, so on and so forth. But what happens when you multiply two fractions? You get a smaller number, of course. So you see the problem here, right? There's an inherently exclusive and eliminatory logic to this. So if you set the blood quantum rule at a certain fraction and then let rates of intermarriage proceed as they have for centuries, then eventually the Indians will be defined out of existence. That's one way of solving the so-called Indian problem. The opening of Reading 4 by Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe illustrates this exclusionary intent by contrasting the racialization of Indigenous peoples with that of African Americans, the latter of which were governed during slavery and Jim Crow by the so-called one-drop rule, where just quote-unquote one drop of black blood made one black. This rule is a form of what anthropologists called hypodescent, whereby the offspring of miscegenation, or so-called mixed-race offspring, are classified according to the racially subordinate parent. During slavery, this bolstered the proprietary interests of slaveholders, whereas during Jim Crow, it protected the supposed sanctity of white supremacy. In contrast, the blood quantum rule is defined as hyperdescent, whereby the offspring of miscegenation are classified according to the racially dominant parent. In other words, a mixed child of white and Indian parents would become less Indian. Again, another way of solving the Indian problem. The inherently eliminatory logic to settler colonialism distinguishes it from other types of colonial rule. All forms of colonialism involve foreign domination. That's what defines colonialism in a generic sense. And as a generic concept, there are different types or varieties of colonialism, such as the form of planter colonialism, that involve the use of slaves and indentured servants to produce staple crops, or extractive colonialism, which involves the industrial or semi-industrial exploitation of raw materials from colonial peripheries. These latter forms of colonialism are sometimes characterized as blue water or saltwater colonialism, referring to the sovereign possessions of overseas European empires, such as British colonial possessions in Africa or India, as opposed to settler colonies, whereby migrants brought their sovereignty with them and established new, quote-unquote, post-colonial states, as epitomized by the American settler revolution in the United States. To illustrate this critical difference, the author of Reading 5, Australian scholar Lorenzo Veracini, uses this analogy. Saltwater colonialism is to viruses, as settler colonialism is to bacteria. So, according to this biomedical analogy, the British Empire and, say, the Indian subcontinent was like a viral form, right? So viruses attach and penetrate host cells, which they rely upon to replicate, in the same way that the British Empire relied upon colonized laborers. Now, that's not to say that the British didn't commit genocide or mass atrocities in the colonization of India, but the practical demands of achieving productivity amidst a gross demographic imbalance structured a wholly exploitative system based on labor. In contrast, the settler colonization of, say, the Americas or Australia did not require indigenous laborers, but rather their land. That's the key difference. Settler colonialism wants indigenous lands, not their labor, which settler colonies aim to provide on their own. Thus, like a bacterial form that does not need living cells to reproduce, settler colonies have their own reproductive capacities, often at the expense of host populations. So this analogy helps illustrate the logic of elimination as an inherent feature of settler colonial societies. And it's important to also understand that settler colonialism is an enduring social structure that evolves and mutates over time. And we'd like to think that settler colonialism can be historically isolated to the past, like it's an artifact of the 19th century, when there were still cowboys and Indians or whatever. Now we'll get a better sense later this semester as to how settler colonialism continues to operate. But for now, I want to come back to what I said earlier regarding the course structure, vis-a-vis the overlapping tripartite frameworks provided by Raphael Lemkin's famously capacious conceptualization of genocide, together with Patrick Wolf's conceptualization of settler colonial strategies. Lemkin's 3 types of genocide are covered in Reading 6 this week by Australian historian Dirk Moses and his co-author. Now, I can elaborate on the discussion forum the background behind Lemkin's tripartite typology of genocidal techniques, particularly as it relates to the early drafting of the 1948 Genocide Convention. But just direct your attention to these particular pages. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, but for heuristic purposes, compare Lemkin's tripartite typology with Wolf's condensed conceptual framework offered here, which explains how different strategies behind the logic of elimination evolve over time under the same overarching principles. These 3 overlapping strategic phases, I posit, broadly correspond with the 3 basic categories of genocidal destruction. So again, we're using this parallel conceptual structure to organize our course outline. So weeks 2 and 3 look at physical genocide in relation to the confrontation phase of settler colonialism, whereas weeks 4 and 5 look at carceration in relation to biological genocide, before finally weeks 6 and 7 look at assimilation in relation to cultural genocide. Reading 7 is a selection from Canadian sociologist Andrew Woolford, and it covers a lot of the same ground as Reading 6. What I like about this reading is that it breaks down the conceptual elements of genocide. For those of you who've taken previous classes with me, this slide will look familiar. Anyways, on pages 31 to 33, Woolford discusses the targeted group element, or what's designated as the genos in the etymological construction of genocide. So what do genocides kill? The UN Genocide Convention is controversially limited to specific group types that are assumed to be objectively stable and permanent, versus a more relativistic and sociologically more fluid and subjective understanding of group life. On pages 33 and 34, Woolford covers the side, or SIDE part of genocide's compound construction, i.e. the physical element of the crime. Now, on the one hand, there is a relatively narrower conception that focuses primarily, if not exclusively, on mass murder, which is an argument I'll come back to the next slide. Whereas on the other hand, we have a much broader definition that includes cultural genocide. On pages 35 to 40, Woolford deals with the mental elements of the crime, i.e. the intent element, which the jurisprudential literature frames in terms of a narrower, more specific form of intent, versus a broader, more general understanding that's more amenable to historical and social scientific research, as opposed to prosecution in a court of law. Finally, Woolford doesn't explicitly cover this last element, identified here as Mariology, which concerns the study of parts in relation to the wholes they form. In other words, how much of a group needs to be destroyed in order to qualify as genocide. I don't want to spend as much time on this 4th element compared with the other 3, but keep in mind that many indigenous peoples were relatively smaller in size, certainly when compared to the nation-states that order our contemporary world. So if your group's population is only a few thousand, then losing a couple hundred people represents a sizable loss, for example. Anyways, you can see all of these elements are on a spectrum of interpretations. There's no single quote-unquote right definition out there waiting to be discovered, and there's considerable ambiguity over where to draw the line as to what does and doesn't count as genocide, as if we have the arbitrary power to act as gatekeepers. So, as you navigate the meaning of genocide as an essentially contested concept, use this chart to map out your own position in the intractable definitional debate. Okay, let's conclude where we began by considering the stakes of using the keyword genocide. This isn't a strictly academic question about genocide in Native Americans, as evidenced by the ongoing history wars in the US and elsewhere. And particularly for those with more liberal leaning sensibilities in the West, there may be an intuitive sense that the keyword genocide just fits in this context, that it's an appropriate word to describe what happened to the American Indians. I mean, obviously, not all of us agree, and we'll see that later this semester when we read Gary Anderson in week 4. But whatever, that's not really the point here. I'm instead intrigued by the emotional reasoning that's in the final paragraph of Reading 8 this week, which is from our magnificent textbook by Jeffrey Osler, who reflects on how he struggled, literally, coming to terms with this history, like he didn't know what to call it. His final sentence is so revealing, and I quote, "I could not escape the conviction that what I was witnessing had to be considered genocide." Now, I read this statement alongside a recent book by Dirk Moses, not included in the syllabus, called The Problems of Genocide, as Osler seems to be admitting that part of the appeal of the G word is its affective power, right? Its powerful emotional appeal and enormous rhetorical weight. Genocide, after all, is commonly seen as the ultimate crime or the crime of crimes. Given its popular association with the Holocaust, it's widely assumed that a situation must meet a necessarily high threshold in order to qualify, even though this perversely ends up privileging perpetrators' intent in our analysis. Putting aside the problem addressed by Wolford about collective versus individual intent, it's morally problematic that the perpetrator's words, not even their deeds, but just their words, end up having the final say. And perhaps not surprisingly, this reliance on perpetrator discourse often ends up foreclosing further analysis. Right? All the perpetrators have to do in the historical record is just call it something else. It wasn't genocide, it was war, it was battle. Right? These types of semantic games have a long history. And so long as mass violence against civilians is framed in strategic rather than strictly racial terms, perpetrators have an alibi. And that's the problem with imagining genocide as a hate crime writ large. Now, I can talk a lot more about the problems of genocide on the discussion forum, but I'd rather us focus on this working set of guidelines for using this highly contested keyword. First, following Osler, avoid framing the issue in terms of an absolute yes versus absolute no, without any nuance or gray zone in between. The question isn't whether or not there's been a single, massive, 500 plus year ongoing genocide across the entire continent. No, instead, our analyses have to be more localized. Even though next week we're introducing a macro level analytical framework, we should direct our attention to the micro and meso levels of analysis. So instead of questioning whether or not there was a quote-unquote genocide in the singular sense, we should instead be asking when and where, specifically, have the conditions for genocide arisen. Next, and this is a tricky one, but we have to reckon with the fact that Indigenous actors have sometimes been implicated in colonial violence. We'll see this next week with the role of militant slaving societies, for example. Finally, we have to appreciate that sometimes, not always, but that sometimes the process of ethnogenesis, or group formation, is a consequence of surviving genocide. We'll see this next week with the concept of coalescent societies, but this point is even relevant this week with regards to the blood quantum rule, which has been co-opted by many native nations as a means of counting one's tribal relations and ancestors. Okay, and that's it. I always feel like I end these lectures rather abruptly, but we can continue on the discussion forum. Remember, you need a post by the end of the week. That includes your opening post, plus at least 2 responses. Also, looking ahead to week 3, we have a short abstract proposal due for the final paper. Refer to the syllabus for more info. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.